when two officers arrested her. They had no idea they'd face her again, this time in court, as the judge deciding their fate. It was a sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park was alive with the sound of children playing, joggers pacing along the trail, and families picnicking under the shade of tall oak trees. Amid this bustling yet peaceful scene, a black woman sat on a bench near the pond, a thick hardcover book resting on her lap. Her name was Naomi Ellis, a well-respected attorney taking a rare moment to escape her demanding schedule. She was immersed in her reading when the sharp screech of tires broke her concentration. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, catching the attention of a few onlookers. Two officers stepped out, their expressions stern, radiating authority. Their eyes immediately locked onto Naomi, the only person sitting alone in the vicinity. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" one officer called out, his voice carrying an air of suspicion rather than concern. Naomi glanced up from her book, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Of course," she replied, closing the book carefully. The second officer stepped closer, his tone clipped. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Naomi raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." She held up the book as if to prove her point, but their scrutiny didn't waver. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded. Her pulse quickened, but she remained composed. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" "It's routine," the second officer said, though his tone implied otherwise. The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur. Some looked curious while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sensing the imbalance in the interaction, Naomi sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. As she handed over her driver's license, one officer took it, scanning the information with unnecessary intensity. "Naomi Ellis," he read aloud, almost mockingly. "What's your business here, Ms. Ellis?" Naomi inhaled deeply, trying to keep her patience intact. "I live in this city. I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" The officer's lips tightened. "We'll see." He handed her ID back, but instead of walking away, they continued to linger, asking questions that felt less like routine and more like an interrogation. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" one officer sneered. "Are you alone here, or waiting for someone?" the other added, his hand resting on his belt in an unmistakably deliberate gesture. Naomi had handled countless tense situations in courtrooms, but this was different. The power dynamic was stark, and their tone carried an edge she recognized all too well. Still, she chose her words carefully. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly. Her refusal seemed to trigger something in them. The first officer stepped forward. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job, and I know the law." Naomi replied, her voice steady. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But reason was not on their agenda. The first officer reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he said, though Naomi hadn't moved. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone to record the scene. "Stop resisting," the officer repeated, louder this time, as if performing for the growing audience. Naomi's heart raced as she felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. She tried to stay calm, even as humiliation and frustration burned in her chest. The officers led her toward their cruiser, ignoring the questions from onlookers. Naomi turned her head toward the crowd, locking eyes with a young woman holding up her phone. For a moment, there was an unspoken exchange, a silent plea to document the injustice unfolding. But as the car door slammed shut, Naomi knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Inside the cramped back seat of the police cruiser, Naomi's mind raced. She had spent years defending clients, standing up for justice, and navigating the legal system. But now, she was on the other side of it. The absurdity of the situation struck her, but there was no humor in it, only anger. The ride to the station was suffocatingly silent. Save for the crackle of the police radio, Naomi stared out the window, her reflection merging with the passing scenery. Her wrists ached from the cuffs digging into her skin. At the station, things only got worse. The booking process was invasive, humiliating, and designed to strip her of her dignity. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and led to a small holding cell with fluorescent lights that buzzed relentlessly. "Enjoy your stay," one of the officers said smugly as he shut the cell door. Naomi sat on the cold bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She replayed the events at the park over and over in her mind. How had such a peaceful moment spiraled into this? The answer was as clear as it was bitter: prejudice. Hours passed before anyone acknowledged her again. A young officer approached the cell, holding a clipboard. "Ms. Ellis, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he said flatly. "On what grounds?" Naomi asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "You can discuss that in court," he replied before turning away. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think strategically. The charges were flimsy, and she knew it. But she also knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. Cases like hers rarely were. Eventually, Naomi was released on bail. As she walked out of the station, the cool night air hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. She spotted her colleague and friend, Rachel, waiting by the curb. "Naomi." Rachel rushed over, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" Naomi nodded, though her body betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm fine," she said, though the word felt hollow. As they drove away, Rachel kept glancing at her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. "I'm not letting this slide, Rachel. Not this time." Rachel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening," Naomi replied. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back, and I will." That night, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and open books. She worked tirelessly, outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from a simmering determination. As the days turned into weeks, the community began to rally around her. The video of her arrest, shared by the young woman in the park, had gone viral. People from all walks of life reached out with messages of support, sharing their own stories of injustice. Naomi's resolve grew stronger with every email, every phone call, every comment. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed. The weeks following Naomi's arrest were a whirlwind of emotions and relentless work. Her law firm was initially hesitant, worried that her public case might overshadow their carefully cultivated reputation. But Naomi didn't flinch. She explained calmly but firmly that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about setting a precedent. The viral video had done more than spread her story. It had sparked conversations across the city and beyond. The footage of Naomi, calm yet defiant as the officers forcibly led her away, became a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Reporters began calling, asking for interviews, but Naomi turned them all down. She wasn't interested in media attention. Her focus was laser-sharp, building a case that would not only hold the officers accountable, but also expose the systemic flaws that allowed such behavior to persist. At night, though, when the world went quiet, the weight of the situation crept in. She replayed the arrest in her mind, the dismissive tone, the handcuffs, the murmurs of the crowd. She thought about how easily things could have escalated further. The thought made her stomach churn, but it also fueled her determination. One evening, as she sifted through her research, Rachel stopped by with takeout. Naomi barely looked up from her laptop as Rachel placed the food on the table. "You've been at this for hours," Rachel said gently. "I don't have a choice," Naomi replied without missing a beat. Rachel sat across from her, studying her face. "You know this is bigger than just a legal battle, right? People are looking to you now." Naomi closed her laptop, finally meeting her friend's gaze. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "That's why I can't afford to lose." Her preparation was meticulous. She combed through similar cases, pulling precedents and gathering evidence to dismantle the officer's claims. She enlisted the help of trusted colleagues, building a legal team that shared her passion for justice. But it wasn't just about the courtroom. Naomi also made it a point to engage with the community. She attended town halls, listened to others who had experienced similar injustices, and even spoke at a local college about the importance of accountability. One afternoon, while walking to her car after a meeting, a stranger approached her. "Ms. Ellis?" the woman asked hesitantly. "Yes, I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice cracking, "for standing up to them, for standing up for all of us." Naomi felt her throat tighten. She managed a small smile. "I'm just doing what I can." The community's support was a double-edged sword. It empowered her, but it also heightened the pressure. She couldn't let them down. Then one day, her attorney called with news. The officers she was suing had filed a motion to dismiss the case. Naomi expected as much. It was a standard move to delay the process. But as her attorney explained the next steps, she froze. "Naomi," he said cautiously, "you should know something else. You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The irony was staggering. Naomi leaned back in her chair, processing the revelation. She had spent weeks preparing to fight these officers in court, and now fate had handed her an entirely different kind of justice. For a moment, she wondered if she could do it, if she could sit on that bench and remain impartial. But then she thought about everything they had put her through, about the people depending on her to make a stand. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was an opportunity to show what real justice looked like. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet murmurs as people filed in, finding their seats. The case was nothing particularly high-profile, an internal misconduct hearing involving two officers accused of excessive force in an unrelated incident. To most, it was just another day in the justice system. The two officers, Ryan Carter and Eric Daniels, sat at the defendant's table, wearing their uniforms like armor. They leaned toward each other, speaking in low tones, their expressions indifferent, almost bored. To them, this was routine, another hurdle to clear, another case to brush aside. Then the door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room fell silent. Naomi stepped onto the bench, her black robe flowing behind her. She moved with purpose, her expression calm yet commanding as she took her seat. She glanced toward the defendants. The reaction was immediate. Officer Carter's face drained of color, his eyes widening in shock. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he struggled to process what he was seeing. It was her, the woman they had humiliated and arrested at the park. Naomi allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she began the proceedings. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat stiffly, their composure faltering. Carter whispered something to their lawyer, who nodded but kept his focus on Naomi. For the first time in weeks, Naomi felt the upper hand, but she knew this wasn't about revenge. Her job as a judge demanded impartiality, and she would uphold that standard. Still, the irony wasn't lost on her or anyone else in the room. As the attorneys presented their opening arguments, Naomi maintained her professionalism, listening intently and taking notes. But every so often, her gaze would flicker toward the officers. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands fidgeted slightly. During a recess, Carter and Daniels stepped into the hallway, their voices low but agitated. "How is she the judge?" Carter hissed, his frustration barely contained. "This has to be a setup," Daniels muttered, shaking his head. "It's not a setup," their lawyer interjected. "It's a coincidence, and you need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here. Your actions are." But the officers weren't listening. They were too consumed by the surreal nature of their predicament. When court resumed, Naomi remained composed, ensuring the hearing proceeded fairly and efficiently. Yet her presence alone seemed to unsettle the defendants. Every time she addressed them, they shifted in their seats, their confidence eroding little by little. At one point during witness testimony, Naomi caught Carter stealing a glance at her. His expression wasn't defiance. It was something closer to regret, as if he was beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Naomi adjourned the hearing, her gavel striking with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As the room emptied, Naomi lingered at her bench, organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of the officers' stares as they hesitated by the door, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. The courtroom was packed the next morning. News of the unexpected twist had spread, drawing a larger crowd than usual for a misconduct hearing. Some were there out of curiosity, others to support Naomi, though they knew her role as the judge meant she couldn't show favoritism. Naomi entered with the same calm, composed demeanor, her robe flowing as she ascended to the bench. The attorneys wasted no time diving into their arguments. The prosecutor methodically laid out evidence against the officers, presenting testimony from the victim of the excessive force incident. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the officers' actions were not just a lapse in judgment, they were a blatant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the very people they are sworn to protect." Naomi nodded, taking in every word, her pen gliding across her notepad. Her focus was unshakable, even as the defendants shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. The defense attorney rose to counter, his tone measured but strained. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident in question, we argue that the situation escalated due to factors beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe this case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures." As the arguments continued, Naomi couldn't ignore the parallels between this case and her own experience, the excuses, the justifications. It was all too familiar. Yet she pushed her personal feelings aside, determined to let the facts guide her. When it was time for witness cross-examinations, the tension in the room deepened. The prosecutor called the victim to the stand, a young man named Jacob. His voice trembled as he recounted the night he was tackled to the ground by the officers during a routine traffic